Hey, how's it going? I kind of just making this video in a response to an article I read. I'm not going to go into like the specific names of the projects, and not in any reason. It's just kind of like I want to keep this more like abstract and sort of like from an idea perspective versus talking about specific implementations. But if anybody wants to check out the article, it was called "ZK rollups are coming to Bitcoin. Here's all you need to know." It's by Namikios. I mean, I think it was a pretty good read. Check it out if you want the source material. But essentially, the idea is that like the concept of zero knowledge proof rollups, which are kind of like the mainstream thing in Ethereum right now, because for a few reasons, some people talk about how ZKPs are better for scalability, etc. But the concept of it is really kind of taking over like the scaling solution space in Ethereum. And it's not really just in Ethereum, right? I think we're seeing like the whole rollup concept kind of like sort of kind of becoming the standard, right? Because you have things like Neon EVM, right, and Solana. It doesn't really matter what languages these are written in, right? I think sometimes people get too fixated in that. And like my last video on Stylus was sort of like just kind of language agnosticism. But the idea behind like obviously like anyone that's been watching my videos for like the past few years knows that like I'm a Bitcoin guy. Obviously, I've been a Bitcoin guy. I'm continue to be a Bitcoin guy. I like the concept of proof of work versus proof of stake, just in general, just the external versus internal vulnerabilities. I think they just have kind of different surface area vulnerabilities, right? But anyways, like the main reason that like I think this is kind of interesting is that like obviously for years there have been so many attempts to bring like Turing completeness, like these smart contracts, like trustless Turing complete smart contracts to Bitcoin. And in my opinion, a lot of them have fallen short, right? Like, of course, we've seen RGB for years. Where the fuck has happened to that project? And that one's really never even made that much sense to me. The discrete logarithmic contracts, I remember people were trying that for a while. And, there's like other things like Stacks or Liquid or other bullshit. Like, I mean, I'm not gonna say bullshit, but other projects like that I don't necessarily think are really like trustless in the sense where like you're really just kind of like defaulting to a different sort of like key holders. You know what I mean? That's kind of been my issue with these other networks. But I do think that like what exactly is a rollup, right? So essentially, it's kind of like a batch transaction to a degree. I could go into more of the data structure specifics, but like it's kind of broad, right? Like in Ethereum, a lot of times you're going to see these rollups where like the Patricia trie. Or like, let me think, like a Merkle root, like a Merkle tree, right? Bitcoin kind of like uses Merkle trees to compress a bunch of transactions that happen to represent state in a single hash value, right? And the hash value is what's saved as that Merkle root, right? That's written to the actual blockchain. And like, don't get too fixed up with these like terminologies again. Like essentially, if you're familiar with the concept of a binary hash tree, that's essentially how a Merkle tree will work. So just think about it from that sense. But long story short, essentially, there are some projects right now, and they're trying to open up Bitcoin to be a DA layer, which I do think makes a lot of sense. And a DA layer is essentially just something, from my understanding, is kind of like a data structure that can be used to leverage kind of like the underlying principles of that data structure so that other networks or data structures on top of it can be consolidated into that one. An example of a DA layer is kind of like when people talk about how like Ethereum's L1 is a DA layer for like other L2s, right? So let's take like Arbitrum or Scroll, for example, right? Like what are they actually doing? Scroll, I'm a little bit more familiar. I think they have two L1 contracts. One kind of handles all the logic, the bulk of the logic. The other one's kind of just like the bridge that I think kind of handles like that is sort of like the relayer in that sense. But like when you're actually writing what the compressed state is, right, to the L1 blockchain, that is sort of what that DA layer is, right? And we're seeing like all these things pop up in the Ethereum space where you have like things like Espresso or Eigenlayer. Eigenlayer is probably the most popular one, I think, right now. Could be wrong. But like I was saying, like we are seeing a lot of like the idea of like these other networks I don't want to say like capitulating because that has negative connotations. People get very, very defensive of that, but I do think it's to a certain level, at a certain degree, it is a capitulation, right? Like you'll have things such as like you'll have things such as like Neon, like I was saying, Solana, for example, is coming on with this Neon EVM stuff. And then you'll sort of have like Binance too, right? OPBNB, they're kind of taking like don't get too fixated with like it's the the optimism stack, because I'm pretty sure that they're also thinking about forking like ZK Sync or I think they should probably fork Scrolls. And I know like if you guys follow like Shreyar on Twitter, he kind of had like an interesting thing about like how Scrolls trying to like modularize their stack or like the order of operations with mainnet. I think that was an interesting tweet. Shout out Scroll Shreyar. That was an interesting read. quick read. But like the issue is that like a lot of these networks are kind of doing the same thing, right? Like see this with Avalanche with their EVM compatible chain. I'm pretty sure Cosmos does this to a degree. I don't really follow the Cosmos ecosystem that much, but I know, like I was saying earlier, like Cardano has also kind of come up with their own ZKP roll up based thing. And so like I'm not gonna don't want to go into the specifics of like how a roll up works, how ZKs work. But I do believe that like in order, and a lot of people are saying that Ethereum, Bitcoin would need some sort of soft fork to make this like interoperable. I don't necessarily think that's true. And in the article, the author goes on to talk about how like ordinals essentially kind of have like this flag structure where if you could kind of think of like in Ethereum, for maybe people that are more familiar with Ethereum, right? Think of like the RPCs, right? So when you deploy a 721 contract, right, you usually have some sort of function that the RPCs, these custom RPCs can run, essentially checking to see if it supports a specific interface. And if you're checking for 721, for example, right, you check the 721 interface, right? It's kind of like a flag if you're familiar with the concept of a flag. So like like the Bitcoin ordinals, like, you might be familiar with like Taproot Wizards, I think is like the most mainstream application of it, right? Essentially they have a flag. So the flag, it kind of signals to the miners, right? The block operators, the node operators, whatever you want to call them. Essentially they can look at it and be like, okay, this is being flagged this way. This data is not necessarily integral to the core consensus later, so I can ignore it, save some computation that way. But if they want to actually like do something based off that data as being indexed into like a larger, I don't want to say it's a cache or a sidechain, but it's like it's a different segment of the larger data structure, right? Because all these things are still being written to chain, but like conditionally, you can kind of choose whether or not you want to like accept that into your own internal calculations or not. So it's kind of up to the specific node operators. And so from that sense, I think that you can actually add this sort of like integration into Bitcoin natively without needing a soft fork, although I think it would be more optimal in a lot of ways with the soft fork. Again, it's a little bit more low level, and I haven't looked to the additional opcode and like what that actually would do. Is it necessary? How does it improve things? So, but let's say for sake of argument, that's not necessary, because I think that the way that it's trying to be created right now essentially is like the first step is essentially creating, like creating some sort of SDK so you can kind of port over like whatever code you want to run for like validation of your own computational system, like your own environment, essentially, and make that compatible with the, what's available in Bitcoin in terms of like data availability layer, right? Like what can you actually write to the blockchain that is verifiable by the people in that network. And from there, you kind of move to the next step, right? Is like once you can essentially like think about it like this, like once you can consolidate, once you can actually write something to the network, right? What stops you from writing some sort of like, proof, right? Like what stops you from just writing another type of like, okay, like we did all this, like, like let's say that they want to have their own like Patricia try, right? Or whatever like state machine type thing that you data structure that you want to use to represent state of your contract. Like I'm just saying that the easiest one to use, well, I'm not going to say the easiest one to use, but I personally think that like if Bitcoiners are serious about this, I think that we should probably try to work more to like integrate the EVM opcodes. And I know that people are very like, adversarial when it comes to Ethereum. But like, I also think that people were talking about like integrating Stark, like the Starknet. I think Starkware in general, I think is one of the partners or one of the teams that I think are working in collaboration with, like Udi and Eric, or whoever. I don't even know how the Taproot Wizards ecosystem really works, but like those guys, right? Like I think they're kind of sort of working together to try to bridge this divide. And some people say that the difference between Snarks and Starks, Starks are supposed to be quantum proof, or they're supposed to be like more trustless. And again, I personally don't really know the difference between Starks and Starks. I mean, I could spit you out some like definitions that I've maybe memorized, but like, to be honest with you, like from a core technical level, I'm not really sure what makes these things fundamentally different. But it's something to research for sure, but I think that that's definitely, and for me at least, and I think that that's kind of where like people are trying to go, right? So my thought goes to like kind of Cairo, and then I kind of try to think of like, okay, well, if we're going to add this type of ZKP roll up, right, using Starks, why don't we take it to the next logical step, which I think is like, using something like Kakarot, right? And I know that like, the article goes on to say that like there's obviously centralization issues with Madara, and Madara I think is like Madara Uchiha. I mean, like I think it's based off of like it's supposed to be the sequencer for the Stark ecosystem, right? Starknet ecosystem, Starkware ecosystem. And I think that like there's issues with that. Obviously, there's always issues when people start talking about, sequencing. The article goes on to like list reasons why that's not necessarily a huge issue. And also similar thing with Arbitrum, right? Is like in Arbitrum, right? Like if you want to post your transaction, but let's say like the sequencers collude against you and they try to front run you, or let's say worst case scenario, they just don't want to include your transaction in like the block, right? In whatever route that they're writing to the L1. So it never gets added to like that state, right? The arbitrum state. But there's actually like an opcode that you can call that basically is a force right? It's not very efficient, it's very slow, but like worst case scenario, you will get your transaction through, right? I think it gets forced in the mempool and you're basically just hard writing it. So a similar thing is supposed to apply here. Again, is it perfect? No, but like, is it a solution that I think at least, solves some problems? Yeah, I would say it's like a decent divide. Like, is it still operate in like a trustless manner? That's very debatable. I mean, obviously it's spectrum. What is decentralization? What is trust? But personally, to the standards that we've seen kind of evolve in the last couple of years, I think it's fine. So I really think that that's an interesting thing. I mean, because like I kind of think like, look, ideally, if you're a Bitcoin dev and you're trying to push these things, like I think you want to get it to the point where kind of like Neon EVM has or OPBNB, where it's kind of like, yeah, you're using like technically you are using the EVM opcodes, but like what did the EVM opcodes really even mean, right? Like those are just kind of like the base commands that you can use to update the global trie, right? To update state. And like obviously we're seeing a bunch of these things. Like I've been doing some more research into fully homomorphic encryption using networks like maybe like Inco, for example, to sort of like kind of add like different type of precompiles or just add there essentially like I think like different types of opcodes that you can put on top of that. But let's just say we start with like the basic EVM opcodes, right? I think that would be a really good value add. And even for people that are like, more, into the Ethereum ecosystem, like I hold the idea that decentralization, like in theory is good, right? Like, don't call me a decentralized theorist, but like theist, but like, I would think that like, it does make sense, right? You want to spread it out. If everything does happen to the base L1, right, you would like to have like EVM networks, that can run, on Solana or Avalanche or Cardano or Bitcoin specifically, right? And I think Bitcoin arguably is, I think it is the most stable decentralized protocol like this that has really ever existed in human history, the one that I'm aware of, right? It's been around the longest. I believe it has the highest uptime. It's like the NBA, man. It's like you want to look at stats, sports in general. You can nitpick stats and make anything look like fucking anything. But you ask me, Bitcoin has defensibility. Like the whole network of within itself, like has defensibilities from a technical perspective that like isn't just objectively isn't offered like in other networks. And whether that makes it better or worse, that's not the argument I'm making. I just think for what Bitcoin does, it's secure. You know what you're going to get with Bitcoin probably more than anything else. And like for me, if I had to trust my life savings on one network, it would be Bitcoin still, right? But anyways, right, like the point is that I think that this would add a lot of like Turing completeness to Bitcoin. And like, again, that's not novel. Some people would say that like things like Stack or Liquid have already kind of done that. I would argue that they really don't because it's not really trustless. But I think that if it were to be done this way, it is sort of similar to like the Lightning Network, but I think that this would run kind of more in like parallel. Although I bet you probably could figure out a way to like build it on top of like Bitcoin's L2, which is the Lightning Network. I think I'd have to do more reading into that because essentially like these channels, these either like the Bitcoin Lightning Network essentially is like a channel, right, with like these pre-signed signatures. And you kind of can do sort of transaction with each other, and there's watchtowers that kind of verify all these things. Like there's steps to it, right? And I don't think these things are like this and adding like like these ZK rollups, whatever. Like I don't think that that's actually going to. They're not mutually exclusive in any way. I don't think. You could argue that they're both competing for the L1 DA layer, but like the DA layer availability. But I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I mean, I think if we want to make Bitcoin a sustainable thing, we have to figure out a way to get the fees higher, right? Like, obviously, I think that there's a lot of like FUD in the market where people are like Bitcoin eventually, like this shit's not going to sustain itself because look at the difficulty rate. Well, like lo and behold, like, I really don't think that's the systemic doomsday issue for people that for Bitcoin, that people think it is. I mean, I've been saying this for years that like realistically, like, look, like if the miners drop off because they just don't think it's profitable, I mean, like who gives a flying fuck? I mean, like Bitcoin has existed with such a lower difficulty rate, right? Like go back to like 2012, go back to like 2011, 2015, 2016, right? Like look at the difficulty adjustments, right? Like even if we went all the way back down there because it just didn't it wasn't economically feasible for these miners to continue to operate. I just don't think that it's as much of a FUD as people make it out to be. However, if you want a more secure network, obviously like you want more hash rate. I know there's a lot of nuance to that, like what I just said, and I'm not going to pretend to know like all the specifics about that, but just high level overview, you want more you want more computation participating in the network, ideally makes it harder to hack. It makes it harder to reorg. It makes it harder to like double spend, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And so I think that this would be a huge value add to Bitcoin. And not only do I think it would be a huge value add to Bitcoin, I think this would just be a huge value add to the whole decentralized space in general. I think the decentralized space needs to come together, right? Like the tribalism that we've been facing, like really since the inception of all of this technology, I would say really as long as I've been in here, right? We've seen like networks still argue about it. Now we see the L2s arguing about it. Like, I just don't really get it. Like, I think like the actual applications are going to outscale, I don't want to say outscale, but like, look, I'm just going to say that I personally prefer to build apps over infrastructure. And that's a very loaded topic. And I guess it's a very hot take right now. I think it might age well. Maybe that's why I'm putting it online, just to like say I fucking did. I said I did it. I called the Dubs would win, like whatever. I mean, bullshit. But like, that's just kind of how I'm thinking about it right now. It's interesting though. I really think that Bitcoin's finally kind of moving in the right step. I mean, I would say that probably, like at least in terms of the last few years, actually seeing Bitcoin core development from a technological perspective, I think this is good. I think this is good for Bitcoin. People are going to talk about like all this bullshit about the maximalists care more about like the like random moral bullshit or like how it incorporates in the US system. I think that has been terrible for like the Bitcoin. Like the second I realized, like the reason I started to focus more of my attention on Ethereum, the Ethereum space than Bitcoin, is really because I started to realize that the majority of people that I was interacting with in the Bitcoin space were like finance people, right? They were more interested in like money, like theory of money, versus which I think is kind of bullshit. The more I think about it, right? I mean, it's important. Obviously, you need to be cognizant of it, but like what really comes down to is we should be thinking about the technology, right? The actual math, the science, like the theories instead of the ideas, right? If that makes sense, like the actual practice, like the actual implementation of things. Kind of like, I hate to like be so trendy Gen Zer about it, but like theory can only get you so far, you know what I'm saying? And I do think that it's an interesting space that we're kind of entering. I think this is great for Bitcoin. Honestly, I'm hyped. This is probably one of the most bullish things, like for me, that I've seen in a really long time. I think this will really bridge the ecosystem. And like, I am a big fan of the EVM standard, right? Like, and like I said, I don't think it matters if like people, I think, have really misconstrued ideas of the EVM. And a lot of times I think that's very possible that EVM really ends up outliving Bitcoin. Right? Like it's just something that we've all kind of gotten used to. And I don't really see any major issues with it because like a lot of things are very patchable. And people will talk about Arbitrum Stylus or like how these contracts are more efficient to be written in Rust or C++ or Go or whatever. And I don't necessarily think that that is incorrect. Obviously, there's some objective truth to that, empirical evidence, I should say. But at the end of the day, right, like what do they boil down to? They're still kind of boiling down to the same codes, right? Like even if it's like WASM based, or like we just kind of need like a universal language that's agreed upon that we all kind of like agree we can use for bridging, for messaging, but mainly to figure out what we're going to do in terms of updating the state, right? It's just kind of like a standardized language, kind of like how we all speak English. And I think that like these opcodes, right? These instructions, I think it doesn't really matter what you use as your DA layer, right? The execution layer, the one that's actually putting together the structure of these of the state, right? I think that's what's important. And I'm not saying it has to be EVM. I just think it makes the most sense. Primarily because like when you actually think of the functionality, like I'm not saying like core functionality, I'm saying like really like experimental functionality, edge cases, like integration between machine learning, decentralized finance, art, all these things, all these multidisciplinary things, right? Like a lot of the common theme is that, a lot of it is done using similar state management tools. And really that's what I think the EVM is, right? It's basically just a state management tool. Could there be abstractions about it? Of course. And like, I advocate for that. I mean, I advocate for all these different new types of compilers, right? I think the precompile game is really going to be interesting as we see things like, for example, like fully homomorphic encryption, become more feasible from a hardware perspective. And really just from an implementation perspective, I think it's kind of breaking a little bit more into the mainstream the last like, couple of weeks. And I would assume that's a lot more in the mainstream in the next couple of weeks, and y'all see why. But anyways, that's just kind of my thoughts about it. Yeah, it's been a minute since I made an Omni Kingdoms update, but I think we should have some cool stuff cooking up if anyone's interested. But yeah, things are going really well. Just in terms of like the technological space, man, I'm just excited to be human. Like I genuinely just think like the way that like, the software is evolving and, it's got me really excited just for the applications of things, to come in my lifetime, hopefully in the next 5 or 10 years, but you never know. It's obviously hard to put timelines on things, but I know a lot of people are going to be like turned off by the market because of money, but those people are probably just sheep anyway. So who cares that much? I mean, obviously it matters. I shouldn't say that. That sounded very pejorative of me, and I honestly apologize. If I could reiterate, it's just like I guess I'm just more fixated on like the actual evolution of the technology, and I think this is really good for Bitcoin overall, and not just Bitcoin. I think this is good for everybody, right? Because like I said, it gives us an additional DA layer, arguably the best DA layer. I think Bitcoin is truly the best DA layer. It has the potential to be the best DA layer. I'll put it that way. But anyways, like I said, just my thoughts. What the fuck do I know? All right, deuces.